Hello and welcome to Building Africa's Prosperity, the show that focuses on filling the infrastructure gap on the African continent and in Southern Africa in particular. I'm Chris Bishop. Now the topic today is infrastructure challenges in municipalities. My guests are Tsepo Ntimane, the head of Metro's Intermediate Cities and Water Boards at DBSA, and Khomotso Letsatsi, the Chief Officer, Municipal Finance, Fiscal Policy and Economic Growth at SALGA. And also during the show, we'll be hearing from a man called David Jackson, the Director of Local Development Finance for the United Nations Capital Development Fund, whom I spoke to earlier in New York. Now, David's had a lot of experience in a score of countries across Africa in municipality and finance, and he spent more than a decade in post-war Mozambique. I asked him to put us in the picture a little bit about his experience.
As some of you may recall, in 1992, 1991, Mozambique was just emerging from a civil war. And at that time, of course, all budgets were centralized. There was no such thing as a local budget or a local government per se. And over the next decade, Mozambique moved to have many municipalities. Maputo, Beira, and Nampula are now financially independent to some degree and are municipalities with their own budget framework. And also there is a system now of provincial and district planning and budgeting and execution of investments and that kind of thing. And I've been working really for the last 30 years, if you like, in this whole question of local government finance in Mozambique, Uganda, Rwanda, Egypt, Angola, and then countries in Asia. And it's really all about getting finances down to the local government level where, if properly managed, they can have a maximum effect. And I think in Mozambique, the municipalities have been a positive experience, all things considered.
Well, how do you think municipalities in Africa have been dealing with this COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, that is a really interesting question, and we've done a lot of research into this. And what is so interesting is that the answer is it depends. There are places like Cotonou in Benin, Freetown in Sierra Leone, where the mayors have really got a hang on it, and they have really managed to keep the virus under control whilst enabling the economy to continue. There are other places where the effect of the lockdown has been worse, if you like, economically than the effects of the virus. And there are other, so it's a really mixed bag. And it goes to show that when it comes to dealing with something like this, it's really the local level where the citizen and the state meet. And it's really the city level or the local government level where all the action is. We're seeing in Uganda very effective work in rural local governments to keep the virus at bay, and neighboring local governments are not doing anything. It really is the difference maker, the role of local leadership in responding to this virus.
That's David Jackson giving his views there from New Yorkers. Straight to the issue now, and starting off with you, Tsepo Ntimane. How much do you think this neck of the woods here, Johannesburg and Pretoria and Cape Town, and I can learn from experiences like countries in Mozambique that David Jackson mentioned there?
Look, David is spot on. Thanks very much, Chris, for having me on. David is very much spot on. COVID-19 has had a major impact on a lot of our municipalities. I mean, in the last 3 months of the just past financial year to June 2020 for our municipalities, the metros, you take Ekurhuleni, for example. Ekurhuleni is the industrial hub of South Africa. Now, if you close the economy down in order to fight COVID-19, which is a very good program that our government is leading in consultation with the World Health Organization, the closing of the industrial hub of Gauteng means therefore that the economy comes to a complete halt. That in turn has a major impact on the revenues of the likes of Ekurhuleni, on the revenues of the likes of City of Johannesburg, and even the City of Cape Town. We are talking municipalities having in the last quarter alone lost 30% of their revenue. Over and above that, you are having collection rates. The normal average collection rate for strong municipalities like our metropolitan municipalities is between 93 and 95%. That is their collection of the current year's billing. Now, collections in some instances have fallen by more than 30% to around an average of 60-70%. That means money that it should be available for service delivery is impacted. So some of the lessons that we can learn is how do you respond as a municipality to some of these things? What has a city like Beira has done? What is, as he mentioned, Cotonou, I was with David last week, we were discussing this, the impact of these things on the African continent. So there are lessons that we can learn from one another. Even in Ghana, for example, Kumasi, Ghana, that's the industrial hub. It's actually a trading port for Ghana. If there are no people moving across from West Africa into the rest of the other parts of West Africa, from Nigeria to the others, that means Kumasi suffers. So we're having all of our municipalities across the African continent are feeling the combination of the impact of COVID-19 as well as the lockdown that's designed to help communities deal better with COVID-19. So there's a lot of lessons we can learn from one another.
Move to the financial side of municipalities now, and Kgomotso Letsatsi, you're the person who's got your eye on the figures, on the books. Just give us an idea and give us a couple of examples, if you will, exactly how much of a drain this COVID-19 pandemic has been on the coffers of municipalities.
So, Chris, I think COVID-19 had its positives and negatives. And maybe just on the biggest negatives is, as Tsepo has indicated, around the revenue under recovery, that in certain instances, municipalities are only recovering 30 to 40%. And that did not help, given that we came from a very low base from a collection point of view. So if you look at the consolidated municipal debtors book, we're sitting at 181 billion, where customers of municipalities are consuming the services and they're not paying for that particular service. So COVID-19 basically came, affected the operating environment of municipalities in ways that we've actually not seen in our lifetime, which actually begs us to answer a few questions in terms of local government as a service delivery facing sphere of government. And you would also see how you would have seen how local government became very instrumental in terms of confronting the reaction of government as a whole around the COVID-19 directives. It was an opportunity to also look at our IGR processes and systems and how robust and resilient they are in an event basically of a crisis, but also just on the infrastructure side. South Africa has got, got pocket of excellence in terms of metros, in terms of how they run and the quality of the infrastructure, even though there's still challenges there around the infrastructure gaps. Then you've got rural municipalities that just don't have the infrastructure that is basically required to empower them to respond to some of these issues that we're basically being presented with. And we saw where there was reliance and over-reliance around water tanks and tankers, where the infrastructure is actually non-existent. And I think really in the main, this environment, although it's challenging and the outlook doesn't look as good from a financial sustainability of the sector, and the fact that we came from a low base around the infrastructure backlog, and also answering how best we structure ourselves as a sector from a finances point of view to be able to close that particular gap. And now we have to catch up in terms of this gap that is actually being brought about by a complete halt, basically, in the economy. But it's definitely an opportunity for us to look at our own systems and processes and how we make sure that we become robust and resilient in the way we operate and the kind of service that we'll then provide to our communities.
Africa has particular problems like markets, like where people have to gather and buy food, and also where people have to live. There are all kinds of constraints when it comes to social distancing, etc., and some of the conditions. What can be done about this?
There are problems, but Africa also has certain advantages as well. I mean, I think one of the things we're learning about this pandemic is that indoors is not good, outdoors is better. So outdoor environments it's much easier to organize social distancing. So what they've done in Freetown in Sierra Leone, for example, is ensure that water stands and other hand washing facilities are expanded rapidly across markets. And in other places, there have been real publicity campaigns using local leaders, traditional leaders, musicians, about mask wearing and hand washing. So if you're in the outside environment and you manage that, you're actually in a better situation in terms of social distancing. One big problem in many African towns is public transport, because if you're crammed into those minibuses and buses, it actually is a lot more difficult. So I think that is an area that there needs to be focused on, how you can deal with public transport. But it's a difficult one, but with the imagination and innovation, there are some mayors and some local leaders that are really managing to keep the virus at bay. And again, I'd like to stress that it really depends city by city, local government by local government. What we're seeing is some places the response is not so good, other places it is excellent. So it's where the local action can make a big difference.
So Tip, I'll come to you for a reaction on that one.
Look, we, Chris, are caught between a very hard rock and a very, very hard place, because we need to protect us from ourselves. And that's why we have governments across the African continent listening and collaborating with the World Health Organization to make sure that we do the right things as communities in order for us to survive this pandemic. The unfortunate reality is there is no known cure at this stage, and that's why governments around the world are collaborating with scientists to try and find a cure. So what do you do in the meantime? You try to keep social distancing. You wash your hands regularly. If you can afford to buy sanitizers, you do afford to sanitize. And if you can afford to stay home, stay home. The reality, though, is, as you said, you have a situation where you have to earn a living versus livelihoods and people's safety. And trying to balance that, that's what our government has tried to do through the National Command Center as well as the provincial command centers. So I would say that as South Africans and as Africans, let us listen to what our governments are saying. Where it is practically possible, please try and follow the advice, because it is designed to and intended to help us. It is a sacrifice we have to make in the short term or in the interim in order that we come out of this. And unfortunately, that sacrifice means that we are going to have an economy that's going to go into recession. We're going to have an economy in which companies are going to have to retrench people. You're going to have an economy where some of those companies may not survive. I was reading just yesterday how a big company such as Hertz, which is a big rental company in the US, is about to declare bankruptcy. So it's a global phenomenon. It's not restricted or unique to South Africa, nor is it unique to the African continent. We just have to find a way to deal with this. We will come out of it. We will come out of it triumphant, but there will be sacrifices that we have to make in the short term.
Khomotso, if I could just go to you on the same subject about financing the fight against COVID-19 and infrastructure. I put it to you that in the cities maybe we can move hand sanitizer around, we can get people there, we can get people protected. But what about if you're in a municipality that's on the border with, say, Mozambique and Tanzania?
You definitely spot on. I mean, if I just look at how a whole lot of inefficiencies that have been unraveled by basically dealing with COVID-19. And I think on the South African context, it actually exposes what the former, we a tale of two economies. We've got contradictions in South Africa, where you've got your metros that are running efficiently in terms of access to broadband. Most of households have access to broadband. But if you go to rural areas, the infrastructure in terms of what we're now terming as the feed utility is basically non-existent, and actually therefore affecting the ability of those municipalities to be agile in their processes. So that on its own actually disadvantages people basically in rural areas. So if you ask me, we're basically never ready. And moving the goods as well became very difficult, as it was obvious. It became very difficult. So even in South Africa, where you look at the areas that are actually struggling in terms of the number of infections and basically death, at the core of it is basically a health system that's basically failing, that was not ready, because we came from a low base in that particular regard. And also just moving the goods and services basically to communities as well becomes a bit of a challenge. So definitely quite a few challenges to overcome as we basically try to deal with the pandemic the best way we know how. But I might just say that the leadership that was basically given initially even at level 5, and that has actually delayed some of these challenges that are actually coming forth at this point in time as we move towards actually the peak in the next couple of months. But it becomes also important that communities actually come to the party in terms of adhering by the guidelines that government basically issues, over and above the interventions that are basically being put in place by government through the local sphere of government. So I think in that particular regard, the leadership that was provided and what local government has basically been doing, it probably gives some confidence that if we work together as government and the various strategic partners, as well as our communities, we should be able to contain the extent of the spread of the pandemic to a lot of extent, but definitely challenging the infrastructures that we basically have, and I think around the health system.
A lot of municipalities have put quite a lot of money into fighting it right now. My question is, what's going to happen, and what worries me, in about 6 months' time when the long-term bills start coming in for municipalities in the fight against COVID-19? What's going to happen then?
Well, that's a great question, and I'd like to make 3 big points. Firstly, that if you like, this is the calm before the storm, because as you quite rightly say, both central and local governments are working on this year's budget. Now, when this year's budget was programmed, money was coming in and nobody thought coronavirus was going to happen. Now, when we get to the next financial year, the next fiscal year, whenever that kicks in, that's when we're going to see real problems. So yes, we're not out of this yet. Even if a vaccine is found tomorrow, the fiscal effects at both central and local level will be huge. The second thing I'd like to say is that what smart central governments are doing is realizing that local governments can actually cheaply make a difference. So you see the British government, for example, acknowledging before Parliament that they made a mistake in trying to organize some of the response measures centrally when they should have just empowered their local governments to do it. And in Somalia, we see that local governments are being given operational expenditure block grants, which can be as low as 50 US cents per capita. And it's a grant to be used not to take on additional liabilities like new staff, but to be used across all departments to deal with COVID-19. This can include hand sanitizers, masks, social distancing measures, enforcement, working with the parks, the education, the schools, the agriculture. And this is a very effective measure. So if central governments provide a little bit of operational expenditure to their local governments, it can be very cost effective. Now, finally, yes, there will have to be some kind of financial reckoning. And here, I think central governments need to take into account that local governments have lost a lot of their tax base through businesses that have closed down and moved online. And the kind of online business, whether it's Amazon or whatever, doesn't pay local taxes versus the regular bricks and mortar business. So there'll need to be some revenue sharing from enterprises that are taxed centrally. That revenue will need to be passed back to the local governments to compensate them.
With David Jackson there again in New York on the thorny subject of how all this is going to be financed. And I come straight to you, Khomoto Letati. You're the person who's got to balance the books at the end of all of this. And it's clear that a lot of municipalities put a lot of money in very quickly because they had to. How are the bills going to be paid 6 months down the road?
So definitely we're actually dealing with uncharted territories. Nobody really, like David is rightfully articulating it, that when we started preparing our budgets as local government, nobody knew that we would actually, at this point in time, actually dealing with a crisis of this magnitude. And unfortunately, it comes at a point where the fiscal purse as a whole, whether you look at national, provincial, local government, is definitely shrinking. But the demand in terms of services has actually increased, in the sense that you have more people at home the whole day that are consuming municipal service. So on the one hand, you've got expenditure going the other direction, and on the other hand, you've got the revenue under recovery. So you would agree that it's actually a very tight space to definitely maneuver. But what it requires from the value chain is to genuinely look at our expenditure as local government, extract efficiencies where we can, do away with the nice to have, basically, and just go back to the basics in terms of providing the services to our communities, whatever that we can provide within the context of the available budgets. But there is no doubt that there has to be some level of a reduction in terms of expenditure, and just basically focus on the basics with the money that we have. And unfortunately, as much as the purse is actually shrinking, we have to do the best that we can. I mean, if you look at the AG report, the Auditor General report that actually came out, and what he has termed the report for the 2018-19 financial year, that there's not much to go about, but there's the wrong hands at the tills. So it's important that those issues around wasteful expenditure, unauthorized expenditure, are actually dealt with as a matter of urgency, so that we can add more into the kitty to be able to deliver services in these difficult times.
I come to you now, Tsepo. You're the man in charge of the water for the major cities of this country. A system that was under strain long before COVID-19 hit, and that needed investment. How are you dealing with that difficult job of maintaining the water supply at a time when people most need it, as we try to ward off this pandemic?
We always have to go back to context when we discuss anything to do with municipal infrastructure service provision. The reason why the in-water infrastructure is dilapidated, there's a number of factors, but let's first talk about the primary one. Before 1994, only a few of us, in terms of racial profile, had access to these services. And post 1994, you then had to widen. And Khomotso just alluded to it brilliantly. In rural areas, we still continue what we used to have in before 1994, people without access to services. And what then happens is people migrate to rural areas, to the large towns and cities, in order to get better services, which then also put pressure on infrastructure. So that's the one. You're getting normal population growth, which is worsened by the rapid urbanization that we are experiencing as a country and as a continent. And then you then have the second thing that Khomotso also alluded to, which is the limited budgets that municipalities have. Then thirdly, again, Khomotso, the Auditor General, referred to it. Even with the limited budget, you do have the wrong hands at the tail, people who don't, some of whom, not all of them, some of whom don't know how to deal with the very limited infrastructure expenses that need to happen and the revenues that they get. So you have that combination that you need to deal with. And people are expecting water. I mean, you woke up and I'm drinking water. That is all water provided by a municipality. Now, that water had to be provided to more people with limited capacity. And then you then also have physical infrastructure that has not been maintained. It becomes very important that you maintain that infrastructure. You also then have to replace the ones that you need to replace. So you have that combination that needs to be taken care of. And in South Africa, we have a beautiful system where stronger municipalities raise their own revenue through rates and taxes and through selling water and electricity to us. In weaker municipalities, they're very much dependent on government grants. And as you know, we've just been through a situation where we've had to come up with an emergency budget. The Minister of Finance did that. The money is limited, but government has come through to the party. They've allocated or reallocated about an additional 20 billion rands. 11, 12 billion rands of that is COVID-19 related. Another 3 to 5 billion is for water and sanitation infrastructure to help the weaker municipalities. And the rest is to then help with the negative impact of revenue of lost revenue, which Khomotso alluded to. Rates are going down, people are not buying as much electricity, or they're not buying as much water. So it's just a beautiful combination. It's exciting to be in local government at this stage, whether you're financing it or you're doing it. But let's have the right skills and the right people running local government so that we can increase service provision to communities. Thanks.
Khomotso, I'm afraid we're running out of time, but there's time for one last brief comment from you. Exciting times maybe, but you've got the very difficult job in finance of balancing dealing with the pandemic and also planning ahead for the future and the growth of infrastructure. Surely you must need the wisdom of Solomon in the next few years or so.
I always say, where there's a will, there's always a way. I know that we haven't seen challenges of this sort ever, but we've been through difficult times in local government in South Africa. If you talk about the recession that we experienced in 2008, it was pretty much that, where some of the municipalities were at a point where they could not even pay salaries. And obviously we see it in this particular operating environment where the number of distressed municipalities is actually increasing. The number of indigent households is basically increasing. But however, municipalities still have a constitutional mandate to basically provide services to every single household within their municipal jurisdiction. So definitely it would require some creativity in terms of how best we utilize the existing resources around providing services and also working with the other spheres of government around consolidating efforts and resources to make sure that municipalities basically remain functional. Because if you have a local government that's basically falling apart, then basically you would have an economy that's basically falling apart. So it's in the best interest of everybody else, our partners, our DFIs, National Treasury, provincial spheres of government, to make sure that at the end of it all, when we get out on the other side, we have a well-functioning local government that puts its people first.
Thank you very much indeed. That was Khomotso Letsatsi, the Chief Officer of Municipal Finance, Fiscal Policy and Economic Growth at SALGA. And also we had Tsepo Ntimane, the Head of Metro's Intermediate Cities and Water Boards at DBSA. Afraid that's all we've got time for on this edition of the show. From myself, Chris Bishop, and the team, it's goodbye.